Hello, thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Shahid Khan. I'm Professor of Hepatology at Imperial College London. I'm going to kick off proceedings by giving an overview of the epidemiology of cholangiocarcinoma, focusing on the importance of coding. As I'm sure you're aware, cholangiocarcinoma is subdivided into three main types, depending on its anatomical location. Intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas arise in the biliary epithelium above the second order bile ducts, whereas distal and extrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma arise approximately below the cystic duct and perihilar arise in between. The importance of these three subtypes is that they are different in terms of their underlying risk factors, the relative importance of different risk factors, how they present clinically, how they're diagnosed, and also how they're managed. Interestingly, there have been studies going back over 20 years now showing that cholangiocarcinoma mortality and incidence rates seem to be increasing globally. And this is a selection of some of the studies, and most recently this paper from Bertuccio's group. Now what this shows, what this study and previous studies have shown, is that the general pattern appears to be that extrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma is decreasing or relatively stable, whereas intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma seems to be increasing. And this figure shows, from Bertuccio's paper, shows age standardized mortality rates from many countries around the UK, as well as Japan, Australia, Hong Kong, and South America, and across the EU for approximately a 20-year period from the mid-90s. Showing that intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma mortality rates in men and women have increased significantly. The highest rates seem to be in France, Spain, the UK, and Australia, with the lowest rates in Latin America. And the reasons for this have never really been explained. So I want to come now to the issue of coding of cholangiocarcinoma, or rather the significant possibility that there has been miscoding of cholangiocarcinoma. So we really need to focus and take a few moments to get our head around the International Classification of Disease, or ICD, coding system, and how the way it's set up has an inherent problem that leads to inaccurate coding. So the ICD from the World Health Organization has a code for every disease, and it's updated at regular intervals. The current version, or version that's been used most recently, is ICD-10, which has a code for intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma and a code for extrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, but does not have a separate code for perihilar cholangiocarcinoma. In parallel to ICD-10 is the ICD-0 from IARC, which is the WHO cancer subgroup, which has a morphology code for perihilar cholangiocarcinoma. And sometimes this is cross-referenced to intrahepatic and sometimes to extrahepatic. What complicates things is that ICD and ICD-0 change every few years. Now, perihilar, or so-called Klatskin cholangiocarcinoma, are anatomically extrahepatic, but not specifically differentiated in routine data. In the first version of ICD-0, some years ago, perihilar cholangiocarcinoma were called Klatskin, which is technically not a term that one should be using internationally. But these cholangiocarcinoma were not assigned a specific histology code and were classified and could be classed as intra or extrahepatic. In ICD-02, Klatskin cholangiocarcinoma were given a unique histology code, but this was cross-referenced to the code for intra, not extrahepatic. And remember that ICD-10, the main ICD system, still did not have a perihilar code. And the relevance of this is that perihilar cholangiocarcinoma are the largest subgroup of the three subtypes of cholangiocarcinoma as seen in clinical practice and in published case series. Now, the other complicating thing is that ICD and ICD-0 are taken up and used in different countries at different times. So for example, ICD-02, where Klatskin cholangiocarcinoma were cross-referenced to the US, was taken up, adopted in 1991, but in England and Wales in 1995. And then the third version, ICD-03, again, went back to ICD-01 and cross-referenced Klatskin cholangiocarcinomas to intra or extrahepatic. So quite confusing. And again, ICD-03 was adopted in the US and the UK at different times and other countries at different times. So in summary, perihilar cholangiocarcinoma, the largest subgroup of cholangiocarcinoma, may have been misclassified in all versions of ICD-0, especially to intrahepatic during the period where ICD-02 was used. Now, if we look at what this shows graphically, so this is from a publication of ours in 2012. The blue line represents age-standardized incidence rates of intrahepatic and the red line extrahepatic, looking at the US data from the SEER database. And what happens, I want to show you in the next slide, what happens when ICD-03 was used instead of ICD-02, was that suddenly the rate switched and intrahepatic went down and extrahepatic went up. And this is just a graphical example of how poor coding itself can lead to dramatic changes in recorded incidence and mortality rates. Another bit of evidence that was recently published from our group in conjunction with colleagues from Liverpool and University College London. We reviewed cholangiocarcinoma case notes with two independent clinicians. We looked at the tumour board or MDT notes, the imaging, the clinical notes for a 2-year period at 3 independent regional hepatopancreatic biliary centres. And we looked at what the diagnosis we came to was compared to the original code that was allocated years before. And in summary, what we found that the actual diagnosis for patients who were assigned intrahepatic, so patients who were given a label of intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma, assigned code C221, in around 33% of cases, there was actually perihilar cholangiocarcinoma. So of a total of 625 cholangiocarcinomas, 226 were coded as intrahepatic, but on examination of the case, 43% were truly intrahepatic, 34% were actually perihilar. And when we looked at all the perihilar cases, 92% of them were coded incorrectly as intrahepatic because they don't have their own code, and neither were they coded as extrahepatic. And if we look at the figures of the official figures, only 1% of cholangiocarcinoma in this 12-year period were called perihilar, which is very much out of keeping with the clinical picture, where around 50%, if not more, are perihilar. So therefore, we need international consistency and accuracy in how we classify cholangiocarcinoma to allow accurate monitoring of disease rates. Bile ducts should be subclassified as intrahepatic, perihilar, or distal. 3 clear subclassifications. As I've said before, they differ in their epidemiological patterns, their pathobiology, how they present, and how they're clinically managed. And so we need to interpret historic trends with a degree of caution. We need to record data uniformly and accurately, and the responsibility to do so lies both with clinicians as well as cancer registries. And reassuringly, ICD-11 and subsequent iterations of ICD-0 will hopefully have separate topography and morphology codes for intrahepatic, perihilar, and distal cholangiocarcinoma. And the 5th edition of the WHO classification gives these 3 distinct subclassifications. So I hope that's been a helpful introduction as to why we need accurate coding and the errors that can occur if coding is not accurate. Thank you for listening.